The humid air of Oahu pressed against the hangar doors as Lieutenant Mary Louise Hawkins stepped from the jeep, the soles of her boots crunching against the gravel. Rain had fallen overnight, leaving the asphalt slick and reflecting the silver bellies of the B-17 seconds lined in rows along the tarmac. The smell was immediate, undeniable. Aviation gasoline mixed with ether, iodine, and the faint, acrid tang of burnt rubber. The odours seemed to cling to the canvas of her uniform, as if the Pacific itself had adopted a scent to warn of both machinery and mortality. Hawkins had been awake for nearly 20 hours. Flight nurses were trained to endure, to push beyond exhaustion, to administer care while the world seemed to tilt and roar around them. But even with training, there was a line, one that separated the clinical from the personal, the theoretical from the immediate. She had crossed that line the moment she arrived at Hickam Field, assigned to the 807th Medical Air Evacuation Squadron. The assignment was clear: fly, care, stabilize, and evacuate wounded soldiers and Marines. But there was no procedure for what she had already witnessed, no manual to guide her when men bled out in a fuselage pressurized less for comfort than for altitude. "Morning, Lieutenant," called Corporal Jameson from under the wing of a B-17G. His voice carried over the metallic drone of idling engines. Hawkins forced a smile. She had learned early that smiles were cheap currency in a place where death often arrived by air. "You've seen it too," she said quietly, gesturing toward the hangar where mechanics in oil-stained overalls worked feverishly to ready aircraft for another sortie. "Another crew lost last night, pneumonia, blood loss, infections we couldn't treat because we didn't have a table, a light, a sterile field." Just hope." Jameson shook his head. "They send us the planes, Lieutenant, not the hospitals." Hawkins knew he was right. The U.S. Army Air Forces had poured resources into fighters and bombers, into strategic bombing campaigns, into the Pacific Theater's logistical web. But in the chaos of expansion, of island hopping, of rushed sorties, medevac procedures had lagged behind. Wounded men arrived on stretchers or in makeshift beds, often hours after injuries that could have been survivable, if only there had been space or hands to intervene in flight. She had seen it. Pale faces, contorted with pain, hands gripping rails, eyes wide in fear, and the thin whisper of life leaving them before she could act. Hawkins exhaled, the air tasting metallic in her mouth. She bent to examine a clipboard lying atop a toolbox. Evacuation manifests, injury reports, names she would never know, and the number of casualties rising steadily. She fingered the page, tracing a line of statistics that felt like a litany of failures. That's when the thought, quiet and unrelenting, arrived. If they won't give me an operating room, I'll make one. Myself. The idea was not born of bravado. It was born of necessity, of observation, and a refusal to witness preventable deaths. She imagined a B-17, stripped of some armament, modified with a narrow table, lamps rigged to the overhead frame, a supply of morphine and antiseptics tethered to the fuselage. The men would lie not in fear of the sky, but in the hope of survival. She would become their surgeon, their nurse, and their guardian, while the bomber carried them over swathes of ocean and jungle, where no conventional hospital could reach. Hawkins walked toward a line of aircraft, boots slapping on the metal catwalks. A mechanic approached, wiping grease from his hands with a rag. "You really think you can operate in one of these?" he asked, his voice edged with disbelief. 4 engines humming, floors shaking, oxygen masks failing, and half the fuselage full of guns and bombs. She did not answer immediately. Instead, she traced her fingers along the rivets of the nearest, B-17. The aluminum skin was cold, unyielding, yet it carried the promise of flight, of possibility. "It won't be easy," she admitted finally. "But men are dying in here, every day, because no one has the courage to try. I'd rather fail at saving them than succeed in standing by while they bleed out." Jameson exchanged a glance with the mechanic. Both men knew courage when they saw it, even if it was wrapped in an unexpected package. A young nurse with wide brown eyes and an unshakable resolve. The hangar doors creaked open, letting in a shaft of sunlight that caught the droplets still clinging to the wing struts. Bombers taxied past, their engines roaring, each one a vessel of destruction, and, in Hawkins' vision, a vessel of salvation. She imagined rigging tubes to transport blood, sterilizing scalpels with engine heat, and instructing medics in the delicate choreography of surgery at 20,000 feet. The details crowded her mind, and for the first time in days, she felt a sense of possibility. She pulled a notebook from her satchel, flipping to a blank page. With a pencil, she sketched the layout of an operating table that could fit within the narrow fuselage. She noted where lighting could be mounted, where supplies could be tethered, how stretchers might be secured to prevent rolling during turbulence. On the back of a ration paper wrapper, she began a detailed diagram of tubing for blood transfusions borrowed from medical field manuals and modified for the unstable environment of flight. Hours passed unnoticed. Mechanics scurried, pilots prepped, and the sky darkened with the incoming trade winds. Hawkins continued her sketches, muttering calculations under her breath, balancing patient weight against cabin space, considering the shift in the center of gravity. The sounds of the hangar tool clinks, engine hums, shouted orders became a rhythm, a metronome for her plans. By late afternoon, the idea had solidified into a blueprint, a B-17, no longer simply a bomber, but a flying hospital. She set her pencil down, leaning against the fuselage, exhausted but resolute. Somewhere above the clouds, men would be wounded. Somewhere below, the Pacific churned indifferently. And in between, she would carve a space where healing could take place, where life could resist the inevitability of war. The hangar lights flickered as the evening rolled in. Shadows stretched long across the gravel, merging with the silhouettes of the aircraft. Hawkins stared up at the nearest B-17, imagining stretchers lined along the fuselage, antiseptic bottles glinting in the dim light, and the hum of engines beneath the tentative rhythm of surgery. She could almost hear the whispers of men she had yet to save, calling her name, relying on her courage, her hands, and her unyielding determination. For the first time since arriving at Hickam Field, Mary Louise Hawkins allowed herself a small, quiet smile. The war would not wait for her plans, but she would not wait for the war. If the army would not build an operating room at 20,000 feet, she would do it herself. And in doing so, she would carry 30 men, 30 lives through the skies and back to the living. The smell of ether and gasoline hung thick, a tangible reminder that this was not a laboratory, not a hospital, but the crucible of necessity where courage and ingenuity would meet. Somewhere over the horizon, the Pacific beckoned. Somewhere, the B-17 waited, and Lieutenant Mary Louise Hawkins knew that soon she would fly. The mess hall smelled of instant coffee, canned corned beef, and the faint residue of disinfectant. It was early morning, and the din of men eating and talking barely masked the scratch of pencils on paper. Lieutenant Mary Louise Hawkins sat at a corner table, a stack of napkins spread before her like blueprints for a cathedral. Her eyes traced lines and angles, her fingers smudged with pencil graphite, coffee stains mingling with the evidence of her planning. She had spent the night in restless calculation. Sleep had been brief, broken by the imagined screams of men trapped in fuselages, the shaking of engines, and the metallic clang of drop tanks. Flight nurses were trained to compartmentalize fear, but Hawkins had learned early that fear could be an engine of invention. She had decided that the B-17's fuselage could accommodate an operating room, and she was determined to make it a reality. The first challenge was space. A standard B-17G Flying Fortress was designed for bombs, fuel, and defensive armament, not for tables, lights, and stretchers. Hawkins tapped her pencil on the napkin, considering the curvature of the fuselage and the placement of bulkheads. "If I remove the radio compartment and the rear bomb racks," she muttered, "I can gain roughly 4 feet of usable length. Enough for a table and a stretcher side by side." Across from her, Corporal Jameson leaned over, a skeptical eyebrow raised. "You're talking about cutting parts out of a bomber to perform surgery?" Hawkins didn't flinch. "It's not cutting, it's modification. The Army modifies planes for every mission: long-range bombing, reconnaissance, electronic warfare. Why not for survival? If men are dying because there's no room to operate, then I'm going to make room. The mess hall fell into its morning rhythm. Men talking in low voices, the scrape of utensils, the occasional laugh that rang hollow against the seriousness of war. Hawkins ignored it all. She unfolded another napkin and began drawing the schematic of a tethered supply system. Morphine, antiseptics, and surgical instruments had to be secured. One slip, one turbulence spike, and the consequences would be fatal. She annotated each piece with notes: Velcro straps, locking clamps, anti-vibration mounts. A young medical orderly approached, eyes wide as he studied her work. "Lieutenant, you're actually planning this?" "Have to," she said simply. "The 339th Fighter Squadron just lost 2 men last night. Their injuries could have been stabilized if we had the means. Hours of delay are hours of death. We don't have time to wait for a hospital on land or an island field. We need to bring the hospital to them." Jameson shook his head. "And the pilots? The flight crew? Won't they fight you?" "They won't fight results," Hawkins replied. She picked up a spoon and jotted another diagram. "I've been talking to the engineers. The P-38 seconds are already handling modifications for extra fuel tanks. B-17 seconds can accommodate this if we remove non-essential components. I've mapped everything: bulkheads, wiring, gun mounts. We can work around them. We have to." She paused, listening to the clatter of trays and the low hum of conversation. She could almost see the men she would save: a sergeant with a fractured femur, a private with shrapnel wounds, a pilot unconscious from decompression. The thought of their faces, of their life hanging in the balance, pressed her forward. She reached for another napkin, this one frayed at the edges, and began sketching a detailed layout for lighting. Overhead lights were inadequate, swinging with the vibrations of flight. Hawkins planned to rig a set of portable lamps from the overhead frame, tethered and weighted to prevent tipping. "Surgical lighting needs to be constant, bright, and secure," she explained to Jameson, who nodded slowly, trying to keep up. "If the plane hits turbulence at 20,000 feet, I can't have instruments sliding across a table. The lights must hold position, the table must be fixed, and the supplies must be within reach." The idea was audacious, almost reckless, but Hawkins had method in her madness. She referenced field manuals, previous medevac reports, and even captured Japanese documents describing emergency procedures on their transport aircraft. The enemy had devised ways to stabilize patients in flight. She would improve upon them. By mid-morning, word of her project had spread. 2 mechanics joined, curious, their hands moving to illustrate points of support. One suggested using the radio compartment framework to support a lightweight table. The other proposed securing oxygen tanks in the bomb bay with tension straps. Hawkins integrated their suggestions into her diagrams, the napkins multiplying into a small library of improvisation. The flight surgeon, Marge, Harold Thompson, arrived unannounced. His gaze swept over the scattered papers, then fixed on Hawkins. "Lieutenant, what in God's name are you doing?" "I'm designing an operating room inside a B-17, she said without hesitation. "We have 30 men who can't wait for the islands to build a hospital. I need the plane, the engineers, and permission to proceed." Thompson frowned. "You understand the risk? Surgery in flight? The shaking, the decompression, the oxygen supply? I to understand it," Hawkins interrupted gently. "And I understand that doing nothing is more dangerous than doing something." There was a pause. Thompson's eyes softened. He had seen her in action before, calm under fire, decisive when lives hung in the balance. "All right," he said finally. "I'll clear you for a prototype flight. But you'll need an engineer, a full supply manifest, and contingency plans. You're taking responsibility for every man on that plane." "Yes, sir," Hawkins replied, her hand unconsciously tightening around her pencil. By noon, she had the prototype outlined. She used napkins, paper wrappers, and scraps of ration paper, covering every inch with diagrams, supply lists, and weight calculations. She even mocked up a small-scale model with metal strips and thread, approximating clamps and straps. Every variable was considered: patient movement, blood containment, lighting angles, and turbulence. The men in the mess hall had begun to watch in, quiet fascination. Some whispered, some laughed nervously, others merely shook their heads in disbelief. But Hawkins didn't notice. She was consumed, focused on the impossible task: to build a surgical theater inside a bomber, to defy conventional limits, and to save men who would otherwise die in the sky. By evening, the table was cleared. Napkins were stacked, sketches folded into her notebook, and Hawkins finally allowed herself a breath. Jameson leaned back in his chair, exhaling. "I can't believe you actually did this," he said. "I didn't do it," Hawkins replied softly. "I planned it. Execution comes tomorrow." Outside, the sun dipped behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the tarmac. B-17 seconds sat in silent rows, their silver hulls gleaming against the darkening sky. Somewhere, beyond the horizon, men were wounded and waiting, and in a corner of Hickam Field, a nurse with determination in her eyes prepared to rewrite what it meant to fight and to save, lives in the air. Lieutenant Mary Louise Hawkins folded her napkins carefully, securing the blueprints that would soon transform a bomber into a lifeline. She had the vision, the plan, and the will. Tomorrow, the real work would begin. The dawn was brittle and grey, the kind that creeps across the Hawaiian horizon and turns the ocean silver with trembling light. B-17 Silver Lining sat on the tarmac at Hickam Field, engines idling like a beast waiting for command. Hawkins moved through the plane with methodical calm, checking straps, instruments, and oxygen lines. Today, she would perform her first in-flight surgeries, not on a mannequin, but on men wounded in combat exercises and transport accidents. Volunteers, yes, but still real bodies with real lives hanging in the balance. Crewmen hustled about, securing equipment and double-checking navigation charts. "Lieutenant," Jameson leaned against the fuselage, scanning the checklist for takeoff. "We've done everything we can on the ground," he muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. "Now it's in the sky." Hawkins nodded, tying the final tethers for the surgical table. "Flying hospitals aren't built in theory," she said. "They're tested in motion. Gravity, turbulence, and adrenaline are the true teachers." The patients were brought aboard, a dozen at first, stretchered carefully into the rear compartment. Their injuries were simulated but severe enough to test procedures: compound fractures, lacerations, and one volunteer with an abdominal mock wound designed for practice suturing under stress. Hawkins' assistants checked IV lines, oxygen, and antiseptic supplies. She moved swiftly among them, checking vitals, reassuring men, and marking priorities with chalk on the floor. Patient 3, femur. Patient 5, laceration. Patient 7, mock abdominal wound. Once the last harness was tightened, the plane taxied and lifted into the grey morning sky. Silver Lining shuddered, then steadied, engines vibrating in synchrony with the throbbing of Hawkins' heart. She moved to the surgical table, secured her own straps, and began the first procedure. Patient 1, a fractured radius. Her hands were steady, gloved, and precise, cutting through simulated skin, clamping, and wiring the fracture with the same meticulous care as she would on a real soldier. The plane rocked with minor turbulence. Each jolt reminded her that these weren't controlled operating rooms with polished floors. This was steel and wind, altitude and airspeed, life and motion. "Lieutenant, minor turbulence starboard," Jameson called from his station. Hawkins acknowledged with a nod, bracing herself as the fuselage rocked. Her hands never faltered. Forceps were guided, clamps tightened, sutures tied. The operation was timed not just by surgical standards, but by the rhythm of the aircraft. By mid-flight, all 12 patients had been treated. Some were minor procedures, others required more, careful work. She maintained constant communication with the flight crew, signaling adjustments, coordinating oxygen flow, and managing supplies. Each movement was choreographed, a dance between engineer, nurse, and soldier. The first real test came with patient 13, a mock abdominal wound designed to simulate internal hemorrhage. Hawkins worked with Assistant Corporal Daniels, holding suction and feeding instruments with steady hands. The plane jolted violently over a thermal pocket. Silver rivets rattled. Hawkins' calm voice cut through the noise. "Steady. Clamp here. Suction there. Keep tension constant." Daniels followed her instructions precisely, trusting the rhythm she dictated. Hours passed, punctuated by the hum of engines and the occasional crackle of intercom. Hawkins rotated through patients, checking bandages, adjusting IVs, and making notations. The cabin was a blur of antiseptic smell, metallic tension, and human resilience. Flight mechanics monitored fuel at altitude, ensuring that maneuvers were smooth enough to avoid interference with her work. Meanwhile, the gunners learned their role in the new mission. Turrets remained manned, but with modified rules: no abrupt recoil, minimal movement, coordination with Hawkins. At one point, turbulence threatened to topple a tray of instruments, and the tail gunner caught it mid-fall, returning it to its secured mount without disrupting the procedure. Hawkins barely looked up, acknowledging the action with a calm nod. Every crew member had internalized their role. Every role was essential. As the plane crossed the midpoint of its route to Midway, fatigue began to show. Hawkins' arms ached from tension and repetition, sweat dampened her gloves, but her voice remained steady. The rhythm of motion, the tactile feedback of instruments, and the pulse of the plane became a meditative force. For the men on the table, it was life. For Hawkins, it was the embodiment of everything she had trained for. By hour 24. Every patient had undergone procedures designed to test the limits of mid-flight surgery. Complications arose, as they would in any real operation. Minor bleeding, fainting from mock shock, instrument slips. Hawkins handled each with precision. Every intervention was documented in her logbook, with notes on turbulence effects, table stability, and crew efficiency. Her goal was not just survival, but repeatable methodology. Night fell, though above the Pacific it was more an endless grey than true darkness. The B-17's lights created a sterile pocket in the fuselage, shadows dancing across steel panels. Hawkins rotated to check oxygen levels and vitals, murmuring instructions. She was aware of exhaustion creeping into her limbs but suppressed it. Every patient demanded vigilance. The final test came in the early morning hours. Patient 30, the most complex simulation, a mock gunshot to the thigh with arterial involvement. Crewmen stabilized the patient, and Hawkins began suturing under extreme stress. The plane rocked as if protesting the intrusion. Yet she adjusted, using her body as a counterweight, instruments tethered, lamp angled perfectly. She completed the procedure successfully, tying off synthetic arteries and applying tourniquets. The simulation was flawless. As the sun rose over Midway, the flight crew exhaled collectively. Silver lining descended, landing on the atoll's runway with precision. Hawkins moved among the men, checking each patient one last time, adjusting bandages, and recording observations. The experiment had succeeded. Not only had she performed 30 procedures mid-flight, but the process had also proven that B-17 seconds could be converted into functional airborne surgical units. In the debriefing that followed, crewmen were unanimous in their praise. "Never seen anything like it," Jameson said. 30 men, alive and treated, in a plane no bigger than a warehouse elevator. Hawkins remained modest, correcting minor procedural notes and updating her log. She knew that tomorrow, in actual combat, the stakes would be infinitely higher, but for now, she had achieved what had seemed impossible: life-saving surgery in the sky. Her final entry in the log that day read simply: all systems operational, table stable, instruments secure, crew proficient, airborne surgery feasible, lives saved, 30. Lessons learned. Innumerable. Next, actual combat scenarios. As the men disembarked, stretching cramped limbs, Hawkins allowed herself a brief smile. The sky had tested her, and she had answered. Silver lining was more than metal. It was a promise that where there was skill, ingenuity, and determination, even war could bend to the will of those committed to life. And somewhere above the Pacific, the engines of a flying fortress carried not just bombs, but a hope forged in steel, sweat, and sterilization. The morning sun had barely broken the horizon over Guadalcanal when B-17 Silver lining rolled onto the runway, engines thrumming like a living beast. The air was thick with humidity, salt, and the faint tang of aviation fuel, a smell that had become almost comforting in recent weeks. Hawkins moved through the plane with practiced precision, checking instruments, securing surgical equipment, and reviewing the manifest. Today was not a test run. Today was the first real mission in which wounded airmen might arrive mid-flight injured from strafing runs, anti-aircraft fire, or enemy interceptors. Lieutenant Jameson approached, clipboard in hand, brows furrowed. Reports indicate heavy flak over Rabaul. This isn't a drill, Hawkins. If anyone's hit, they'll be coming to you in real time. Are you ready? She nodded, adjusting her surgical mask. I've been ready since the day I stepped on this plane. We have 30 lives on board today, and every one of them counts. We adapt, we act, we survive. The crew moved with a silent urgency, loading bombs, checking, ammunition, and coordinating flight paths with the accompanying fighters of the 13 Fighter Command. Hawkins walked past, her gaze calm but sharp, ensuring that every surgical table, every clamp, and every instrument was in place. The crew knew her reputation, a nurse who had turned a B-17 into an airborne operating room. Now they would see if it could save lives under fire. As the silver lining lifted from the runway, the Pacific stretched beneath them, endless and merciless. Hawkins strapped herself in, hands steady on instruments, even as turbulence shook the fuselage. The first injured airman arrived via the rear hatch, a young navigator with shrapnel embedded in his shoulder. The stretcher rolled forward, guided by Corporal Daniels and 2 enlisted crewmen. Shrapnel, right deltoid. Hawkins assessed quickly. Tourniquet first, then extraction, prep suction. The plane pitched slightly, a jolt that could have dislodged her focus, but Hawkins adjusted instantly, using the aircraft's frame as leverage. Instruments clicked, clamps locked, and the first life-saving procedure began. Within the first hour, 3 more wounded men arrived. 2 gunners with leg lacerations from flak, 1 bombardier with a concussion and deep facial cuts. Hawkins triaged immediately, delegating less critical procedures to assistants while she tackled the most urgent cases. The cabin was a controlled chaos of antiseptic smell, shouted instructions, and the constant hum of engines. Midway through the flight, the silver lining entered hostile airspace. Anti-aircraft flak exploded in the distance, black smoke columns rising like malevolent flowers. The plane shuddered, and Hawkins gripped the surgical table, her gloves slick with sweat. "Brace!" Jameson shouted. The fuselage lurched as shrapnel tore through the air nearby. One of the gunners cried out, dropping instruments. Hawkins didn't pause. With calm precision, she stabilized the table, reassessed the patient, and continued the procedure. Each jolt, each roar of artillery only sharpened her focus. By hour 6, 7 wounded airmen had been treated. Hawkins' logbook expanded with meticulous notes. Procedure times, complications, effects of turbulence, crew coordination, and vital signs. The surgical tables, once a simple experiment, had proven their worth under conditions no one could replicate on the ground. The most severe case arrived around hour 8. A bombardier with a massive abdominal wound, arterial bleeding, and signs of shock. The stretcher was rushed into the operating area, assistants stabilizing the patient as Hawkins assessed the situation. "Clear the area!" she commanded, voice cutting through the roar of engines and distant flak. Instruments were set, gloves adjusted, IV lines connected. Hawkins began suturing, each stitch deliberate, her hands moving with practiced speed. The silver lining lurched violently as anti-aircraft shells exploded nearby, a violent rhythm of war. Hawkins braced against the table, using her body as a counterweight. One assistant's glove slipped, a momentary panic, but Hawkins corrected it instantly. Steady! One motion at a time. Outside the fuselage, fighters engaged enemy interceptors. Machine gun bursts rattled across the plane's exterior. Hawkins didn't look up. Each pulse of adrenaline, each jolt, each vibration became part of her operational rhythm. Time was measured in breaths, stitches, and heartbeats. 2 hours later, the abdominal procedure was complete. The patient was stabilized, and Hawkins moved to check other men. She coordinated with Jameson, who reported minor damage to the fuselage from near misses but no critical mechanical failures. The crew had learned to operate as a single organism, pilots, gunners, nurses, and assistants moving in synchrony, a ballet of survival. By the time the silver lining cleared the last stretch of hostile airspace, 18 wounded men had been treated. Hawkins was exhausted, sweat and blood mingling on gloves and mask, yet she remained vigilant. The final dozen patients awaited her attention, arriving sporadically as the plane continued its course to the forward base at Rabaul. The last 2 hours of flight became a test of endurance, precision, and mental fortitude. Minor complications arose. Instruments dropped, IV lines kinked, and a patient briefly lapsed into unconsciousness. Hawkins handled each with calm authority, issuing commands, performing emergency interventions, and documenting every action. By the time the plane touched down, every wounded airman had survived the flight. As the silver lining rolled to a stop on the tarmac at Rabaul, the crew exhaled collectively. Hawkins assisted the men off the stretchers, checking vitals one last time, adjusting bandages, and coordinating with the ground medical team. She recorded her final notes, highlighting procedural successes, turbulence effects, and lessons for future missions. In the debriefing, Lieutenant Jameson was candid. You've done something no one thought possible. 30 wounded men, mid-flight, under fire, all stabilized. That's beyond remarkable, it's history. Hawkins merely nodded, fatigue etched on her face, already thinking about the next mission, the next improvement, and the next life she might save. Her logbook entry for the day was succinct, almost clinical, but beneath the words lay the weight of 30 lives and 30 hours of relentless action. All systems functional, crew proficient under combat conditions, mid-flight surgical capability proven, lessons learned, trauma prioritization under fire, table stabilization techniques, instrument tethering protocols, lives saved. 30. Next, mission refinement and airborne hospital expansion. As the sun set over the Pacific horizon, Hawkins walked along the tarmac, the roar of planes fading into evening calm. The war had tested her ingenuity, courage, and skill, but she had prevailed. Silver lining, once a simple bomber, had become a flying testament to life, hope, and human resilience amidst the chaos of war. The first whispers of Hawkins' airborne surgical success had begun to circulate through the 13 Fighter Command, carried by pilots, navigators, and crewmen alike. At Henderson Field, the Pacific sun hammered down, sweat soaking khaki uniforms and saturating the scent of aviation fuel, salt, and earth. Hawkins disembarked from Silver Lining, exhausted but determined. Her mission had proven a radical concept, that combat nursing and surgery could be conducted mid-flight under enemy fire. Now, the question loomed, could this innovation be institutionalized across the Pacific theater? Colonel Richard L. Jameson awaited her in the command tent, a figure of authority amidst the flapping canvas walls and scattered operational maps. Hawkins, he began, his voice measured but firm, your work is unlike anything we've seen. 30 men stabilized mid-flight. That's unprecedented. But reports indicate skepticism at higher levels. The Air Force wants hard data, protocol, and reproducibility before adopting such a method. She nodded. I anticipated that. Today's logbook covers every patient, every procedure, and every complication. We've identified turbulence protocols, table stabilization methods, instrument tethering, and triage prioritization under fire. It's all documented. This can be replicated with the proper training and equipment. The next week became a whirlwind of demonstrations, briefings, and debriefings. Hawkins worked alongside medical officers, flight engineers, and surgical technicians, constructing mock-ups of her airborne operating room to show command staff how procedures could be performed without compromising flight safety. The tent hummed with controlled chaos, instruments clanged, charts were consulted, and models of B-17 fuselages were used to simulate mid-flight conditions. "We must standardize this," Hawkins explained to a group of skeptical surgeons. "These aren't improvisations. They are protocols tested under combat conditions. The surgical table must be braced against the fuselage frame. Instruments tethered. IV lines and suction systems stabilized. Patients triaged according to wound severity and flight phase. This isn't theory, it's practice verified under fire." The presentation included reenactments of flak scenarios and turbulence simulations, using weighted platforms to mimic the plane's movements. Hawkins demonstrated how clamps could hold, how sutures could be placed, and how multiple patients could be managed simultaneously. The surgeons watched in astonishment, some taking meticulous notes, others visibly shaken by the audacity and success of the methods. By mid-April, the Air Force Medical Board sent representatives to observe live operations. Hawkins prepared meticulously, replicating her procedures on a series of practice flights. Engineers monitored the fuselage integrity, while medics and assistants executed trauma care under turbulence simulations. Each detail from table restraints to instrument sterilization mid-air was scrutinized and adjusted. Finally, on April 18, Hawkins led a demonstration flight over the Coral Sea with a mixed crew of B-17 airmen and volunteer medics. The mission included non-combat injuries staged to simulate realistic battlefield trauma, shrapnel wounds, concussions, and deep lacerations. For the first time, Air Force observers witnessed procedures conducted at 15,000 feet while the plane executed maneuvers replicating evasive action under enemy fire. The results were undeniable. Patients were stabilized within minutes, vital signs maintained, and no procedural errors occurred despite turbulence. Observers took careful note. Every table clamp, every tethered instrument, and every surgical maneuver had been carefully choreographed. Hawkins' logbook had been transformed into a formal operational protocol. Back at Henderson Field, the formal evaluation meeting convened. Colonel Jameson spoke first, outlining the significance. Airborne surgical intervention has been proven viable. This operation, conducted by Lieutenant Hawkins, demonstrates a method by which we can preserve combat strength and save lives that would otherwise be lost before reaching base hospitals. We must now discuss logistics, training, and deployment. Medical officers raised questions about equipment standardization, sterilization in flight, and the limitations of surgical intervention without anesthesia in turbulence. Hawkins responded calmly, citing her detailed observations. The use of local anesthetics, pre-flight stabilization, and efficient teamwork minimized risk. She also emphasized redundancy. Each instrument had backups, and each procedure had contingency protocols. By May 1943, the concept was formally recommended for integration into 13 Fighter Command operations across the 13 South Pacific. Hawkins' methods were adapted into a field manual titled Airborne Emergency Medical Operations Protocol, distributed to all B-17 units engaged in high-risk missions. Her meticulous documentation, patient logs, surgical notes, turbulence adjustments, and post-flight recovery statistics became the cornerstone of this manual. The strategic implications were immediate. Fighter and bomber crews, previously reliant solely on base hospitals hundreds of miles away, now had a fighting chance in the critical moments following injury. Morale improved, particularly among aircrews on long-range missions over enemy-held territories. Hawkins' airborne operating room became a symbol of innovation, courage, and human ingenuity amid the chaos of war. Amid the operational successes, Hawkins continued to refine her methods. She analyzed medical records, noting which injuries were most effectively treated mid-flight and which required ground intervention. She worked with engineers to design improved table mounts and instrument tethering systems, as well as with anesthesiologists to optimize pain management in a moving aircraft. Each adjustment stemmed from real-world observations, not theoretical assumptions. Meanwhile, word of Hawkins' methods spread beyond the Air Force. Reports reached Navy surgeons, Army medics, and even the War Department. Discussions began on adapting airborne surgical protocols for transport aircraft used in Europe and the Pacific, signaling the potential for a permanent transformation in combat medical care. By early June, Hawkins was not just a nurse or a technician. She had become an innovator whose ideas would influence airborne medical operations for years to come. She remained modest in her debriefings, emphasizing teamwork, preparation, and adaptability rather than personal heroism. For her, the 30 lives saved during the April 3 mission were proof enough that the work mattered. In quiet moments, however, Hawkins allowed herself reflection. The men she had stabilized, the terror of flak-filled skies, the rhythmic hum of engines, these were imprinted in memory. She understood the fragility of life at altitude, the thin line between survival and loss. Yet she also knew that innovation, courage, and meticulous planning had altered that line. War teaches many lessons, she noted in her journal. Some are tactical, some strategic, but the greatest lesson I have learned is that human ingenuity can prevail in even the harshest conditions. 30 lives saved today are a testament to preparation, adaptability, and courage, not mine alone, but of every hand that worked in unison. By the end of June 1943, the airborne operating room concept was formally adopted across 13 fighter command missions. Hawkins' methods were codified, her logbooks archived, and her recommendations implemented. For the first time in the Pacific Theater, mid-flight surgical intervention was not an experiment, it was doctrine, tested and proven under the fire of war. The dawn over the Bismarck archipelago was a blend of molten gold and thick mist. From the airfield at Henderson Field, the B-17 seconds of the 339th Bomber Squadron rolled forward, engines growling, propellers slicing through humid air. Lieutenant Clara Hawkins, clipboard in hand, observed the meticulous pre-flight checks with unwavering focus. Each crew member knew the stakes. The target was a heavily fortified Japanese supply depot near Rabaul, the operational heart of enemy forces in the region. Intelligence had confirmed an influx of troops, munitions, and aircraft reinforcements, making this mission one of the riskiest undertaken in months. For Hawkins, the mission carried dual weight. Beyond strategic objectives, it was the first full-scale test of her airborne surgical procedures under sustained combat conditions. Previous missions had been primarily evaluation flights or limited personnel rescues. This one promised chaos, flak, fighter, interceptors, and the inevitable medical emergencies arising mid-flight. She could not allow improvisation to dictate survival. Preparation had to be flawless. By 0630 hours, the B-17 Silver Lining taxied into position, joined by a squadron of 12 bombers. Hawkins conducted a final inspection of the makeshift operating room she had installed. The reinforced table was braced to the fuselage, surgical instruments tethered, IV lines pre-filled, and antiseptic supplies stocked in portable containers. Each item had a designated place, every motion choreographed. The crew, though initially skeptical, had come to trust her judgment. Hawkins' calm demeanor inspired confidence. Lieutenant Hawkins, Captain Samuel Pierce, the aircraft commander, said, adjusting his flight cap, "If anyone can keep half the squadron alive today, it's you." His voice carried a dry humor, a thin veneer over the tension that gripped every soul on the tarmac. Hawkins offered a brief nod. Words. Unnecessary. The work ahead demanded focus, not reassurance. As the formation lifted off, the engines vibrating through her bones, Hawkins mentally rehearsed every step. The first 15 minutes were uneventful. the Pacific expanse stretching endlessly below. Then, at precisely 0932 hours, the warning lights blinked a flight of A6M0s approaching from the northeast. Fighter escort engaged immediately, tracers crossing the sky like angry lightning. Within 10 minutes, the first casualties occurred. A flak shell exploded near the lead bomber, showering the fuselage with fragments. Gunner Corporal Jameson was struck by shrapnel in the left shoulder. Hawkins reacted instantly, securing the patient on the operating table and stabilizing him with tourniquets and IV fluids. The cabin shook violently as the aircraft banked evasively, but her hands moved with methodical precision, each suture, clamp and bandage executed as though gravity itself had paused. "Keep pressure on the wound," she shouted to Technician Lopez, who assisted her. "Clamp ready and monitor his vitals. Move the IV line if turbulence worsens." Minutes later, Sergeant Davis, seated near the rear of the aircraft, suffered a concussive injury from anti-aircraft flak ricochet. Hawkins navigated the narrow passage, table clamps scraping against bulkheads, and applied a rapid cranial stabilization procedure. The crew witnessed what seemed impossible: surgical intervention at 15,000 feet under enemy fire, without halting the mission. Throughout the flight, Hawkins rotated between patients, prioritizing according to injury severity. She administered local anesthesia, controlled hemorrhage, and maintained communication with the aircraft commander regarding cabin access and patient positioning. Her logbook, open on a portable clipboard, recorded every action in real-time, timing, dosage, and procedural adjustments meticulously noted. The battle intensified as the formation approached. Rabaul. Anti-aircraft fire erupted from the harbor installations below, tracing bright orange lines across the morning sky. Japanese fighters swarmed, engaging in aggressive dogfights with the bomber escorts. Hawkins' operating table quivered with each evasive maneuver, yet she persisted, tethered instruments and clamps preventing catastrophic slippage. By mid-morning, Hawkins had treated 14 crewmen, ranging from shrapnel wounds and lacerations to fractured limbs. Each intervention adhered to the protocols she had codified: rapid stabilization, minimal movement, and continuous monitoring of vitals. Despite exhaustion, her precision never faltered. Communication over the intercom confirmed additional casualties. Lieutenant Harris, the navigator, suffered a deep abdominal wound from shrapnel penetration. Hawkins directed a two-person team to secure him on the reinforced table. She implemented a mid-flight laparotomy technique, adapted from prior simulations, carefully avoiding turbulence-induced instrument displacement. As the aircraft banked sharply to evade flak, she maintained focus, her hands steady, eyes trained on the patient's vitals. The mission's turning point came over the northern approach of Rabaul Harbor. The formation faced intense flak concentrations shells detonating with deafening force, concussive shockwaves rattling the airframes. Hawkins' heart pounded, yet her movements remained deliberate. Each procedure executed was a balance between medical necessity and flight safety. Crew members marveled, whispering to one another, "She's saving lives while dodging death itself." At 1,145 hours, the bomb run was executed flawlessly. Despite heavy fire, the squadron delivered ordnance on the supply depot, crippling enemy infrastructure and thwarting reinforcements. Silver Lining sustained minor damage, but casualties continued to mount. Hawkins and her assistants worked tirelessly, rotating patients as necessary, stabilizing those who would have otherwise succumbed to shock and blood loss. By early afternoon, the formation began the long return flight to Henderson Field. Hawkins had personally treated 28 men, administering interventions ranging from splinting to complex abdominal stabilization. 2 critically wounded personnel remained in extremis, their survival contingent upon continuous monitoring until landing. The landing was tense. Silver Lining's fuselage shuddered as it touched down on the short, battered runway, engines roaring as brakes fought the momentum. Hawkins coordinated with ground medics, transferring patients to triage tents with minimal delay. Every procedure she had conducted in-flight had successfully held, not a single life lost due to in-flight medical failure. After the mission, the debriefing tent was a scene of subdued relief and solemn acknowledgement. Commanding officers praised the squadron's effectiveness, but the focus quickly shifted to Hawkins. Colonel Jameson, now present with an expanded medical advisory team, regarded her with a mixture of awe and professional scrutiny. "Lieutenant Hawkins," he began, "your work today has not only saved lives, it has demonstrated the viability of airborne surgical intervention under full combat conditions. We will document every procedure, every adjustment, and every observation. The Air Force will consider formal deployment of this capability across all high-risk missions in the Pacific." Hawkins, exhausted but composed, replied, "The procedures must remain disciplined and standardized. Training is essential. Today's success depended on preparation, teamwork, and adherence to protocols. Without that, the risks outweigh the benefits." Word of her achievements quickly spread through the Pacific theater. Reports reached the War Department in Washington, where medical officers began evaluating potential applications for European operations and future long-range bomber missions. Hawkins' methods were cited in internal memos, her logbooks requested for review, and her recommendations incorporated into draft manuals for in-flight medical care. Despite the accolades, Hawkins' reflections remained grounded in reality. In her journal she wrote, "Today, 30 lives survived because of preparation, teamwork, and courage under fire. But war is indifferent. Each mission carries loss, and each innovation must be tempered with respect for human limits. This is not heroism, it is duty executed with precision, and every life saved is a testament to collective effort, not individual skill." The mission's legacy became immediately apparent. Other B-17 crews requested training in Hawkins' methods. Medics and nurses across the theater sought instruction, eager to replicate her success. Engineers proposed modifications to bomber interiors to better accommodate in-flight medical procedures, inspired by Hawkins' meticulous documentation. By the end of July 1943, Hawkins' airborne surgical techniques were formally integrated into 13 fighter command protocols. Every long-range bomber mission now included provisions for mid-flight intervention with trained personnel, reinforced tables, and secured medical kits. The doctrine not only preserved combat strength but also instilled a renewed sense of morale among aircrews facing the relentless dangers of the Pacific skies. In quiet moments, Hawkins allowed herself to reflect on the human dimension of her work. Each procedure represented a life, a story, a family spared grief. The horror of war remained ever present, yet innovation and courage had carved a space where survival could triumph over inevitability. She understood that her work was part of a larger continuum, the evolution of battlefield medicine, the adaptation of technology, and the indomitable will of those who refused to yield in the face of mortal danger. By the time the sun set over Guadalcanal, Hawkins had not only proven the efficacy of airborne surgery under combat conditions, but had also cemented her role as an innovator, a leader, and a witness to the transformative power of meticulous preparation and unwavering courage. The 30 lives saved that day were more than statistics, they were a testament to what could be achieved when human ingenuity met the crucible of war. The heat over Guadalcanal was relentless, an oppressive weight pressing against uniforms, hats, and fatigued bodies. By early August, the airstrip at Henderson Field had become a hive of activity, a living testament to the strategic pivot of the Pacific Campaign. B-17 bombers, P-38 Lightnings, and transport planes moved with precision, yet beneath the mechanical rhythm lay the human toll, the invisible strain etched into every face, the quiet exhaustion of those who had witnessed the sky become a battlefield. Lieutenant Clara Hawkins arrived at the airfield before dawn, her uniform crisp, her notebook clutched tightly. Unassuming, commanded attention among medical personnel and aircrew alike. The mission from July 14th had achieved unprecedented success, 30 lives saved mid-flight, but the work was far from over. Today, she would brief a new contingent of medics and engineers on the standardized procedures for in-flight surgery, formalizing the protocols that had saved her squadron. The makeshift lecture area was nothing more than an open hangar with benches and scattered charts, yet Hawkins treated it with the same seriousness as an operating theatre. She laid out diagrams of the B-17 fuselage, detailing reinforced areas for operating tables, equipment tethering points, and patient stabilization methods. Each procedure was described with precision, accompanied by photographs taken during the July mission. "Observe the positioning," she instructed, pointing to a detailed sketch of the aircraft's interior. "In turbulence, unsecured equipment is fatal. Every clamp, every suture kit, every IV line must be tethered. No improvisation in the air." Her voice was calm even, yet carried an unmistakable authority. A young flight surgeon raised his hand. "Lieutenant Hawkins, during the mission, how did you manage simultaneous casualties without halting the aircraft?" Hawkins paused, recalling the tension of the dogfight over Rabaul. "It required delegation, strict triage, and preparation. I had 2 assistants trained in advance. Each had designated responsibilities. One monitored vitals, the other managed instrumentation. I performed procedures based on severity. Timing was everything. Chaos is inevitable, but preparation converts chaos into controlled response." By mid-morning, engineers from Lockheed and Boeing had arrived, carrying prototypes of reinforced surgical tables and modular medical kits. Hawkins guided them through practical demonstrations, showing how each modification reduced risk during evasive maneuvers. Notes were taken, sketches revised, and real-time adjustments made. The cross-disciplinary collaboration signaled a turning point. Battlefield medicine was becoming an operational priority, not a supplemental function. After lunch, the focus shifted to documentation. Hawkins' logs from the July 14th mission were reviewed in painstaking detail. Each entry: time of injury, procedure performed, medications administered, patient response was scrutinized by medical officers and squadron leadership. These records would form the basis of an Air Force directive, codifying in-flight surgical protocols for all long-range bomber missions in the Pacific Theater. While administrative work occupied the morning, Hawkins also attended to personal reflection. In her journal, she wrote, "What began as improvisation has become doctrine. Yet every number, every procedure, every life saved carries a shadow. War spares none entirely. Our innovations prolong survival, but they do not eliminate risk. Each mission confirms our humanity in the midst of inhumanity." By late afternoon, a series of incoming reports arrived from field medics stationed on nearby islands. Casualties from recent skirmishes had strained local medical facilities. Hawkins coordinated a deployment plan for airborne surgical teams, advising commanders on equipment allocation and personnel rotation. Her operational insights, drawn from direct experience in Silver Lining, ensured that airborne intervention could now be scaled beyond a single bomber or squadron. As evening approached, a small ceremony was convened to honor the crew of the July 14th mission. Colonel Jameson addressed the gathered personnel, military brass, and journalists from the Pacific Theater Press Bureau. "Today we recognize a remarkable achievement in both courage and innovation," he declared. Lieutenant Clara Hawkins and her team demonstrated that survival is not dictated solely by strategy or firepower, but by ingenuity, training, and steadfast commitment to human life. Their actions have preserved the strength of our squadrons and set a new standard for combat medical operations. Hawkins, ever modest, accepted the commendation quietly. She acknowledged her assistants and crew members, emphasizing that the mission's success was collective. "No procedure, no life saved, is the work of one individual," she stated. "Every action, every decision, every hand involved was part of a coordinated effort. This is the essence of our duty." The broader impact of Hawkins' work was immediate. Commanders requested that airborne surgical protocols be disseminated to all Pacific bomber groups. Training programs were established, incorporating her techniques into flight surgeon curricula and standard operating manuals. The concept of a mobile operating room within the aircraft became a recognized innovation, bridging gaps between battlefield exigency and medical capability. In the weeks that followed, Hawkins' methods were field-tested in subsequent missions. The results were consistently remarkable. Lives that might have been lost to hemorrhage, trauma, or shock were now preserved until safe landing could be achieved. Morale among bomber crews improved, knowing that medical intervention was no longer limited to the ground. Pilots and gunners flew with renewed confidence, aware that their injuries, however severe, could now be addressed mid-air.